Welcome, mushroom lovers, mycologists, amateurs, and mushroom enthusiasts from all around the world. This is the Mushroom Revival Podcast, and we're bridging the gap between you, our lovely, incredible listeners, and the fantastic world of fungi. So we're unbelievably obsessed with the power of mushrooms, and we bring on experts from all around the world to dive deep with us into the world of mushrooms. So fasten your seatbelts and tune in and shroom in to another episode of the Mushroom Revival Podcast.
And today we are honored to welcome Gunther Weil, who was one of the core graduate student members of the Harvard Psilocybin Project in 1960 to 1963. He worked closely with Timothy Leary, Ralph Metzner, formerly known Richard Alpert, Ram Dass, and he escaped the Holocaust, helped Tim Leary run the Concord Prison Experiment with psilocybin mushrooms, edited the book The Psychedelic Reader, Classic Selections from the Psychedelic Review. Gunther is also a 50-year practitioner of Tai Chi and is recognized as a master teacher of Qigong. Quite the bio, so thank you for joining us and giving us some time today.
I've lived a long life, so, when you live long enough, you can do more stuff, so...
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yes, with your eventful past, we're so grateful that you've agreed to spend time with us and tell us a lot about your life. Do you want to start off by sharing some of these stories and just speaking from someone firsthand who was involved with Timothy Leary and escaped the Holocaust and how you ended up at Harvard? I mean, how did this happen and unravel?
Sure. Happy to reconstruct whatever I can of that memory or memories. I was 2 years old when my parents and I fled Nazi Germany. And so I don't have a lot of memories from that period, but, I was definitely impacted by those experiences that my parents had. And as in my mother's womb, and then as a 1 and 2 year old little boy, I was definitely impacted by the traumatic circumstances. That came back to haunt me years later when I was older, and had to do a fair amount of work with that material, both in therapy and then also actually, interestingly enough, in the course of working with the psychedelics at Harvard with Tim and Richard or Ram Dass and Ralph and others. I had access to those experiences, or at least the underlying symbolism and vestiges of memories and the kind of aspects of trauma that were fixated at a pre-verbal stage of my life. So that has been an interesting kind of therapeutic theme that's woven through my life. It's interesting because even now, as we're coming up to the November election and we're seeing the what I perceive to be very strong elements of fascism arising in this country, how it's easy for me to get triggered by what we're all experiencing, with the threat to democracy that this administration and this president presents. And I'm hopeful that as a country, we'll be able to deal with that effectively at the polls in due course. My journey with psychedelics began in the fall of 1960 when I was a graduate student at Harvard, and I went to meet with Tim Leary, who had been assigned as my faculty advisor.
Lucky you.
I didn't know who he was. He was just a name to me because at that time, and I don't know how it's done these days, but at that time, incoming students were assigned a faculty advisor, somewhat randomly, I believe. And then, of course, you would do an initial interview and have a conversation and so on. And if at that point or within a certain period of time, if you didn't feel it was a right fit for you, you would have the option to be assigned to someone else. So with some flexibility. So I entered the building where the program was located on a street called Divinity Avenue, was aptly named at Harvard in the fall of 1960. Having spent the summer prior to that in Cambridge, working as a research assistant to another famous psychologist, Dr. Harry Murray, who had pioneered the development of what's called the TAT, the Thematic Apperception Test, which at the time, and I don't know how it is now, but for many, many, many years was a major piece of the repertoire of psychological testing. And he was a very interesting guy. He had been analyzed by Jung and had written somewhat extensively about Moby Dick from a psychoanalytic, psychodynamic perspective. Very interesting guy. And it turned out in the fall, he and Tim actually became friends, and Tim guided him through a psilocybin journey. And he was very open to it because he was very comfortable dealing with archetypes and his own subconscious, He was a psychiatrist also, trained in psychiatry, a psychologist. But in the fall of that year, I entered this building on 5 Divinity Avenue, the Center for Research and Personality. And I went into what had been a former utility closet on the first floor, which turned out to be Tim's office, because there were no other rooms or offices available in the building. It was pretty packed. So he made do with it. It was a little bit strange, but it was fine. So we sat, and he began to share with me the experiences that he had the summer before, not that summer, but the summer before, when he had been in Cuernavaca, Mexico, and had taken the mushrooms, actually, in the original form, the psilocybin mushrooms from a curandero in Mexico. And he's written a lot about that. It's a fairly well-known story, how he and his close friend, Frank Barron, were introduced to the mushrooms. So he described to me how his interest in consciousness and the role of sacred substances, such as mushrooms and others, was of great interest to him, and that all of his previous work in psychology was really on the back burner. And he was well known for having developed a very sophisticated psychological assessment called a multidimensional analysis of personality. But his focus was on consciousness, because he reported that he learned more in that one session around the swimming pool in Cuernavaca than he did in all the years of studying and teaching psychology and research. So he asked me if I was interested, and he was very very kind and humorous, and said, I totally get it. If you're not interested in this, you're better off than working with somebody else. So I kind of raised my hand and said, count me in. I'm very interested. So unbeknownst to him at that time, and it was no reason to bring it up, I had some years of experience actually with cannabis, having been introduced to cannabis through some friends who are a little bit older. I had a deep, abiding interest, which remains to this day, in jazz and the jazz culture, particularly the kind of bebop era. Having lived in Paris, having lived in Europe, and spending a lot of time in Paris the year before, I hung out with some pretty famous jazz musicians like Bud Powell and Oscar Pettiford and others who were living in Paris or traveling in and through Paris for varying periods of time. And even before that, when I was actually, believe it or not, still in high school, I had an interest in jazz. So I was introduced by some jazz musicians who took a keen interest in my interest. And so I had a familiarity with altered, if you will, consciousness, So there was no reason to bring that up at the interview with Tim. And I'm glad I didn't, because it turned out, which I discovered later, because cannabis was illegal, he had a very negative view of it at that time. Because at that time, mushrooms or the synthetic mushrooms or things like that were not illegal. They weren't classified substances. So, and Tim was actually pretty straight, except that one experience in Cuernavaca was so transformative. So, it was never conservative by any means, but his kind of straight profile of an academic, tweedy psychologist was beginning to more than fray at the edges. So, as I said, I didn't bring it up at that time, but having had those experiences of living in Europe, and prior to that, I grew up in Milwaukee. My dearest friend, who I grew up with, Mike Malvon, who passed away a few years ago, was a jazz musician. And Mike and I were like just kind of exploring the fringes of society as experienced and communicated by people like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, from that era. This was not the hippie era. This was the hipster era. This was the beatnik era. So this was prior to the hippies, if you will. So I grew up in that era. So if there's any kind of subcultural identification I might have, it's with people from that era, and I spent time in San Francisco and City Lights bookstore and some of the landmarks and people in the jazz scene in San Francisco, and also, a very small version of that in Milwaukee and traveling to Chicago to see Miles and Coltrane play. And so I was full of that culture, and of course, cannabis was like a big piece of that. So I said yes, and we were off and running. And a couple of weeks later, I had my first psilocybin experience at Tim's house in Newton, Massachusetts, a big house that he was renting from a Harvard professor who was on sabbatical for the year in Europe. And that's where I had my first psilocybin experience with Tim at that point.
Was this with the actual mushroom, or did you have a synthetic?
We had a synthetic because he already had worked out an arrangement with Albert Hoffman at Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in Basel. I believe it was Basel where it was located. And so we were receiving monthly shipments of psilocybin. I think 20 or 30 milligram doses of psilocybin in a tiny little bottle with about, 30, 40 doses. I don't remember what was in it.
What did it look like? Was it like a clear liquid?
No, it was a little blue pill.
Okay.
Huh.
Yeah, a little pill.
And each pill was a dose?
I believe so. I don't remember now. I think maybe there were 20 milligram doses. I'm not sure. And maybe we took a couple or three, but it was fairly pretty intense, actually. And that was my first experience of that level or that degree of consciousness alteration, if you will, or expanded consciousness, or the word psychedelic means psyche opening, right? Psyche revelatory opening, psychedelic. So the opening of the psyche, if you will. And that was quite amazing. So many of the reported effects, much of that having to do with the enhanced visual and auditory, the enhanced sensory dimensions, Later on, when we were exploring LSD, it was another level, right? LSD was a whole other level of cosmic consciousness, if you will, right? There were elements of that, depending again on setting and dosage in psilocybin, but my memory of that in the first year, where we were doing almost weekly sessions with psilocybin, was that the experiences were just so incredibly aesthetic and powerful. In the sense of aesthetics, and beauty, and of course the fluidity of consciousness.
At this time, was the Harvard Psilocybin Project initiated by Ram Dass and Timothy Leary? That was in 1960, correct?
Yes, it was initiated. And that was the beginning. Over the course of that summer, I'm sure, again, I didn't arrive in Tim's office until the fall, but over the course of that summer, prior to the beginning of my graduate studies, Tim was experimenting with psilocybin. And I think Richard or Ram Dass, also his first experience, I think, was in the late summer or fall. I wasn't there with his first experience, but the first experience I had was with Tim and Richard and a number of other, and Ralph Metzner, George Litwin, who was another key person in our group, and a number of other people, including a psychiatrist who was the head lead psychiatrist, or the only psychiatrist at the Concord Prison. That was his first experience too. And he was a black gay psychiatrist. Can you imagine that in 1960, to be a black gay psychiatrist working in the prison project, given, the level of racism prevalent at that time, particularly in Boston and in many other places. That may have been the only gig he could have gotten at that point, given where the society was at that point. But he was a wonderful man, very engaging, very clever, very funny. And that was his first experience. And it was essential that we develop a relationship with him because he was the one who was really overseeing medically the program at Concord, which started I believe, later that year or the beginning of the next year. It was in the first 6 or 7 months, I believe.
And what was his name?
His name was Madison Presnell.
So how did the Concord Prison Experiment start? Was it Timothy Leary's idea? Whose idea was it? And how did that develop? Did you reach out to the prison? Did the prison express interest? How did this develop?
It was Tim's idea because, again, coming back to what happens with psilocybin or any psychedelic is a deeply transformational experience. And Tim saw potential for that type of transformational experience with the deep personal insights relating to one's karma and conditioning and all of that. He saw that, and he hypothesized, if you will, that if there was a possibility of affecting the recidivism rate in prison. The recidivism rate is the rate at which people return to prison after they commit a crime and they've served a sentence. At that time, and I think it hasn't changed in many, many, many years, the rate of recidivism is between 72 and 75% of inmates who are in prison are released to go back. And Tim at that point was developing what he called the kind of game theory of consciousness, which had to do with societal roles and rules and regulation. Tim was a baseball fan, so he kind of viewed it through the lens of a game, basically, with various rules. And so one of the rules he saw operative in prison culture, well, he viewed it as a kind of graduate school for prisoners. So young criminals would be sent to prison and they would learn their craft from older prisoners. And that, in fact, is how it happens. It still happens. So if there was a way of intervening there and interceding and transforming that through a deep experience where one could come to terms, with the fundamental conditioning and the sense of being imprisoned, not only in the external sense, but being imprisoned by virtue of one's mind and stereotyped emotions and conditioning and patterns, having that breakthrough. So he approached the judicial or the system, the mass mental health system, and specifically that aspect of the system, the criminal justice system or the penal system in Massachusetts, and proposed an experiment to see if the use of these pharmaceuticals, quote unquote, could impact the recidivism rate. Now, nobody knew what this stuff was. And we were Tim was a Harvard PhD, and Ralph and I were graduate students. So we had the Harvard imprimatur, we had, the credibility and all of that. And nobody knew, as I say, in the penal system or correctional system, that's the correct word. Nobody knew what this stuff was. They viewed it as just another experiment using pharmaceuticals. Now, there's a long history in prisons. There was a long history. I don't know if it's done now. I don't think so. But at that time, if you were a convict and you wanted to apply to be a volunteer in a drug experiment that was conducted by pharmaceutical companies to test the impact on humans beyond the laboratory testing stage, prisons where this work was done, at least in Massachusetts. So it was voluntary, and you would, if you volunteered for that, and it could at times be life-threatening or health-endangering because you were early stages, first human trials, you would get time off. They would call it good time. You'd get time off your sentence.
Wow.
So we then designed an experiment. We recruited prisoners who met certain criteria. The main one was that they were not in for a life sentence because we needed a release date so that we could test a hypothesis of whether or not this experience or series of experiences could reduce the recidivism rate. So they had to have a release date within about a year or so. And we began working. We had a group of 12 to 14 people. and we would go in twice a month. We would walk into the prison. Concord Prison, by the way, was, I think, 100 years old back in the 60s. And it was like a Gothic structure, like out of a Frankenstein movie, gray, dark stone, really Gothic, And and at that point, there weren't a lot of, if any, like electronic doors and stuff you see in modern prisons. These were like gigantic, large steel doors, which were opened with big keys. And when they slammed shut, they made a lot of noise. So it was very, very, very visual, in terms of that kind of scene. And we walked through the courtyard of the prison, through the front gate and through the courtyard to the back of the courtyard where there was the prison hospital wing, if you will. It's a fairly large room. And as I said, we'd walk through there and we'd end up there and they'd lock us into the room, basically. So Tim and I and Ralph, and generally it were two or three of us, sometimes two, sometimes three of us. And with, again, I remember the exact number, 12, 14 prisoners who, as I said, met the criteria that we had designed. And they were ushered in by guards and they locked us in. And we had a series of cots arranged around the perimeter of the room. And at that point, early on, we brought in some Indian prints, and we, believe it or not, we even brought in some incense in order to create the kind of set and setting, if you will.
Right, the Gothic doors and stone,
you gotta neutralize those weird vibes.
Right, so imagine like this prison hospital with a few Indian prints hanging and the smell of incense. Well, the incense didn't last very long because the guards objected. It was too weird. They thought we were smoking pot or something, So they disallowed that right after the first session. But we were allowed to bring in a few pillows and Indian prints to try to warm the thing up. We did the best we could with the setting part of set and setting. And you may recall, or your listeners may know, that Tim developed this idea of set and setting based on what indigenous cultures have always known, that when you do a sacred ritual, you do it in a setting that is holy, that is spiritualized, if you will, through trained guides, through wounded shamans, what have you. So we did the best we could to do that. And Tim coined the phrase set and setting, which was part of the kind of game theory model, So set and setting, according to Tim, accounts for about 95% of what happens in a psychedelic session. So, the dice were really stacked against us because here we are in a prison situation with criminals, many of whom had very violent pasts. They ranged with a lot of different offenses. And we began working with them. And half the group were given a placebo and half were given a little blue pill, right? The blue pill.
Yeah. How much experience did you personally have with psilocybin before you started administering it to these prisoners?
I had multiple sessions. I probably had a half a dozen or more sessions.
So you were very familiar with the headspace that they could potentially be entering. With someone in prison, the trauma must be, it's high on the trauma meter, but...
Oh, big time. I mean, off the charts. Yeah. So, everyone is traumatized, more or less. I don't think, maybe that's too bold a statement, but I think almost everyone has some form of trauma in their life, different points. And but criminals have a lot of trauma, and it's passed on generation to generation. It takes a lot to break through. And a hypothesis was that having this deep transformational experience would change the set, would transform the set part of set and setting, transform the set from the kind of patterns of conditioned paranoia and anger and rage and fear that were driving these guys, that it could provide an insight, a deep insight that could create the change. Well, at the end of the day, we were right, but we were wrong also, because as much as a deep transformational process can be extremely helpful or maybe even necessary for change, what's required is the kind of ongoing work on oneself that's needed. beyond, and I'm talking here about a kind of therapeutic or psychospiritual methodology, whatever it might be, that one stumbles across or one is exposed to, that's needed in order to so-called integrate the insights or the experience into one's daily life. And that, by the way, during the so-called psychedelic renaissance we're seeing now, people are coming to the same realization. So an organization, for example, like MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which has been receiving a lot of money to do now stage 1, and now they're ready to move into stage 2 trials, pending possible FDA approval, which looks likely maybe a year or two from now, to use MDMA as an agent for dealing with post-traumatic stress and trauma. It's very powerful and it can be very helpful, but it's embedded in a therapeutic context. As a standalone, I would say it's possible for it to work, but not too likely because the condition patterns are just so strong. So jumping way ahead, what we discovered when guys got released, that they went back into the lifestyle that they had before because society, the ordinary society at that time, didn't really make it possible for them to be employed.
Even now.
Yeah.
Not much has changed.
Yeah. So once we realized that, it was kind of, the ship had sailed already, but we moved ahead quickly and we worked with a guy named Chuck Diedrich, who had developed a program called Synanon, which was a program for working with drug addiction. It was a 12-step program modeled on AA. Chuck had taken LSD, actually. It was very powerful for transforming him from his addiction. So he developed this 12-step program, and we adapted it then for the prison population that we had been working with. And we were trying to raise money for it, but we were so far ahead of our time. Imagine, first of all, using psilocybin, using a psychedelic agent as a transformative experience, combining that with a 12-step program. Even at that stage, AA was relatively new, and then developing a 12-step model, trying to raise money for something that was so outside the box, so outside of what society was able to understand, we were just unsuccessful. If anything like that were to be done again today with prisoners, for example, it would be really necessary, in my opinion, a real robust follow-up program. Based again, I think 12-step program is really terrific in terms of kind of helping support the integration of the deep insights.
Integration's huge, and this is even more important, with weaving capitalism into this resurgence of the psychedelic renaissance that we're seeing now, kind of on the shoulders of what the work that you're doing in the 60s, is that a lot of companies are coming in and unfortunately some people don't have the highest integrity and they're just looking for fast cash. And, that's just an unfortunate truth. Some people, are coming in with the best intentions and highest integrity, but, I can see how a company would not want integration, to have people keep coming back to their retreat or keep coming back to their pill or whatever. And it's also with integration, I think this can be radical for, our health system, to have something that, with proper, substance set and setting and integration can be something that can actually heal you and not just covering a surface level symptom that you need to keep coming back again and again and again. So I'm excited and it's good to talk with you to learn from our mistakes from the 60s. And, it was a time as well where it was legal, so there wasn't as many ramifications. So, a lot of people talk about the Concord prison trials and also the Good Friday experiment of being a little loosey-goosey. And at the time, it was unbelievably radical and nobody was on board with it, or not that many people. So were you involved in the Good Friday experiment at all?
I was, yes. Yeah, I was. So that's a whole other story. But let me we can talk about that, but let me come back for a moment to your point. We faced a different set of issues in the 60s because this stuff was totally unknown. and people don't do well with the unknown. And also, given Tim's personality and the overall kind of thrust and direction and enthusiasm that we had about discovering what we felt was kind of an elixir of transformation, we were pretty evangelistic. And so we created a part of our enthusiasm and evangelism helped to create a certain counter force, right? It's like yin and yang. If you have yin, you always have yang, right? If you initiate something very strongly, it's one of the laws of nature, if you will, that you're going to get an opposing force. And then there's some kind of reconciliation that has to happen between what's initiated and what's resisted or denied, and then there's a reconciliation. So we're in a phase now, as opposed to the early 60s, of these substances being recognized. So, Pollan's book and Gwyneth Paltrow and the commercialization, the publications. Yeah, we're in a phase where this stuff is being decriminalized vis-a-vis psilocybin and Oregon and Denver, right? A few places where it's being decriminalized. It's not being legalized, but it's being decriminalized, which is a big step, right? And with MDMA and other things that are being researched, they may likely then become part of the pharmacopoeia of pharmaceutical companies. Then you're dealing with a whole other set of issues than what we dealt with, but they're equally important and daunting, which is the commercialization. And as you point out, people have different motives for entering into the space. So I have heard stories in the last year or so of clinics popping up for doing ketamine, which is legal, by the way. You may know that. Ketamine is legal. It's a horse tranquilizer and actually has been used in surgical operations. It is a drug that's used in surgery as a deep anesthesia, as an anesthetic, but it is legal, although it's required, you have to be a physician to prescribe it. But I've heard some stories recently of people going to a clinic, having a ketamine injection, or they've even developed now a sublingual ketamine, and having some support for a couple of hours, and then being sent home with a prescription for subliminal ketamine. Wow. Without any guidance, Yeah, you're going to see more and more of that, and hopefully not. But I think that's one of the real risks of the commercialization and the so-called medicalization of these substances. That is why an organization like MAPS is doing everything it can for therapist training purposes, to train a generation or two of therapists who have had this experience themselves and who know how to help people navigate as guides in it. I myself had the opportunity last year to take MDMA in a setting with a guide. I didn't really need it, but I didn't know I didn't need it because it had been so many years since I've been experimenting. I thought I would take advantage of somebody with more experience. And it turned out I didn't really need it. All that person really needed to do was to help me go pee a couple of times and bring me a glass of water or two. And basically I just was my own guy. Once I stepped into that zone again, it was totally familiar. Mm-hmm. And I felt totally comfortable with that. I've also had the opportunity to explore psilocybin mushrooms a number of times in the last 2 years. And so it's kind of piqued my interest again at this stage of my life. And I'm in my mid-80s, in my early 80s, to offer whatever I can offer in the way of guidance and support, which is partially my motivation for doing these kind of podcasts or interviews with folks like yourself. I think of the group at Harvard, of that core group of Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, aka Ramdas, Ralph Metzner, George Litwin, myself, we were the 5 core people in that. I think George Litwin and myself are the only ones left. Ralph died, last year, and Ramdas died about a year ago or a little less. Tim died a bunch of years ago. I have lost touch with George Litwin. I don't know what he's up to. But as effectively speaking, I'm the only one left in that group who was able and willing to talk about it. And so people are finding that of some interest.
Yeah, I noticed that you had had a surge in interviews in the last couple of years,
Yeah.
just from doing research on you and discovering them. And I actually wanted to kind of circle back to your time at Harvard. I mean, the 60s at Harvard was such a historical decade. So much was going on in the world. And, you had Ram Dass and Timothy Leary as an advisor. But wasn't Andrew Weil also a fellow student? I don't know when he was there. And then Sasha Shulgin was studying organic chemistry at the same time. So
Yes.
yeah, is there any other key notable people that were in your circle? And did you have relationships with Sasha or Andrew?
Yeah, I didn't know Sasha. I never met or knew Sasha. Of course, I knew of him. Andrew Weil, my namesake, although we're not related, was a Harvard undergraduate. I was a graduate student. And there's the whole history of Andrew's connection with Tim and our work, and that he was the author of this article in the Harvard Crimson that blew the lid open. There was a whole karmic connection there. And then his becoming later very famous, both early on, he was interested in mycology also, and herbal stuff. He used to go to Telluride often for their festival there, I believe, and he became a well-known physician and a holistic doctor. But as an undergraduate, he was responsible, and it would have happened anyway. He just played a role in blowing the lid open on what happened in that Harvard Crimson article. So we had a lot. There were many years where we collectively, but particularly Tim and Richard, had a very strained relationship with Andrew Weil. Eventually, Tim's nature was not to hold on to stuff. Richard, prior to Ram Dass, tended to hold on to stuff more. But even he, later on, I think they had a reconciliation, and I think Andrew visited Ram Dass in Maui some years ago. But there are many other people that came through. Alan Watts, for example, came through and spent a few months with us and joined in some sessions. He was an interesting character. And we had, of course, Aldous Huxley, who was an early advisor to Tim, and Arthur Kessler, the historian and cultural historian, sociologist, I forgot, or political scientist. He came through. There are many people that came through and had sessions with us. And of course, Alan Ginsberg and Peter Olevsky and all kinds of people. So it was a hotbed of, of transformation.
Yeah, no kidding.
And you were just describing that you're kind of the only one left, and you've had such a rich history in taking all the lessons from your life into now. Can you tell our listeners about what Value Mentors is and what you do now with helping people?
Sure. Well, when later on, after things blew up, I got my first teaching job at Brandeis University. Abraham Maslow, the psychologist, gave me my first teaching job. Abe was interested in what we were doing. He was working at that point, he had already started to develop the hierarchy of needs model, which became very famous in psychology. He was working on peak experiences, what he called peak experiences, and how those impacted the hierarchy of needs. And we were in the business of creating them on a weekly basis. He was studying them. So he was curious, more than curious. I don't know how we met, but we were introduced, and we had a number of dinners and lunches together. And he asked me if I would be interested in a teaching position at Brandeis, and that he was the head of department at that time, so he had a certain amount of clout. So I said, yes, I would be. I was looking for a way out at that point. I had to finish my thesis. I was under a lot of pressure because there are a lot of the people in the department that wanted to get rid of everybody, including the graduate students, when things fell apart. So having an offer from a prestigious university, it made sense to me. So I had two young children. I was a family man, a dad, and a husband and a father, and I needed to make a living, and I wanted to get out of that whole imbroglio at Harvard. It was time to start my life, if you will, or next part of my life. So I accepted. And I got involved with teaching and practicing psychology. I was a therapist for a number of years. And one thing led to another. And in the course of my academic career, which involved a number of different universities where I had teaching positions, Brandeis was my first, and then I taught at Boston College. And then later I received an administrative appointment with some teaching responsibilities at the University of Massachusetts in Boston when that campus opened. So I was involved in academia, and I was also earning some extra income doing first doing therapy and then discovering the field of coaching and consulting. I started to develop some skill sets in the area of working with organizations and coaching individuals. After a number of years, I came across the topic of human values and how important they were as core motivators for everything we do on a day-to-day basis, and how often people are usually not aware of their core values, what they inherited from their culture or from their parents or their family systems or other dimensions that influence us in terms of their set. So an important aspect of set in the set and setting formula is the psychological conditioning and the patterns that arise. And values, to me, I discovered this quite a few years later, were a very interesting doorway into that. So I started playing around with that, and having a background in research, I was interested in seeing if there was a research methodology that could actually measure human values. And I had a number of false starts, tried out a number of different methods. I discovered that within the field of psychology, there was a tradition of values developed by a psychologist named Rokic, and who had developed a little methodology for that. But I didn't find that too robust. So one thing led to another. I had a number of false starts, and I finally ended up discovering a methodology that was very robust that had been developed by a Maltese Jesuit who ran the Vatican's Office of Social Justice Communications in Latin America, and his partner, who was a British sociologist who had also gone through psychoanalysis. And the two of them developed called a Hall-Tona scale of values. And it was originally developed for the use of theological students who were working in internships with these guys in Latin America, working with indigenous peoples who were oppressed by the colonial cultures, and to try to measure get a handle on measuring their worldviews and their sense of efficacy and agency in dealing with the political and economic conditions that they were suffering in. So this tool was developed in that context. So I discovered how powerful it was. At the same time, it had a lot of theological baggage. So it couldn't really be applied in business or in other ways without really, offending a lot of people. It was fine within a religious context, but outside of that, it needed to be radically revised. So I began working with Hall, the Hall-Tona, Brian Hall, his name was. And one thing led to another, and then a former partner of mine and we licensed the methodology, and they began to develop it further on our own, develop our own IT system and our own approach to it. And that in turn led a number of years later to an affiliation with a group based in Australia that had also licensed the same methodology from Hall-Tona some 15 years before we did for the Pacific Rim. And so I then joined forces with that group and brought the next iteration of that methodology back to the US, so to speak. And I've been working continuously with that for the last 12 or 13 years now, and continue to refine and develop that. So I could trace an interesting connection between the psychedelic experiences and my interest in human values. I see values as a really powerful concept and construct and tool for opening up and deepening an understanding of the worldviews or the lenses through which we look at life. This is one of the things that psychedelics do, right? They suspend your worldview for a moment. and you can see through the lenses you're looking at. Right now, I'm looking through these reading glasses, and I forgot until I started talking about this metaphor, I forgot I had them on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, these have reading glasses are measured in a distortion measure called diopters. So these are like 2.25 diopters, which is what my eyes need at this stage. Now, the diopters are actually a distortion, right? They distort the so-called external reality, and I'm looking through a distortion lens, which helps me read, helps me see you on the screen. But I don't realize after 30 seconds or a minute or less or instantly, I forget I'm looking through these lenses. That's what worldviews are. We all have them. We're all living inside worldviews that we don't really understand. We don't even realize we're living in worldviews. So it takes a major life crisis, like a near-death experience or a powerful psychedelic experience or whatever it takes, a divorce, bankruptcy, the loss of a loved one, a life-threatening illness. There are a handful of deeply transformational events that can provide an opportunity for someone for a few moments or an hour or two or three to step outside their conditioned patterns and really grok, really understand emotionally and intellectually what they've been seeing through. So values are a way of a methodology, if you will, when they're used in the way that I use them for helping people understand the lenses through which they look at life, their core motivators for what they do day to day. So I see an interesting correlation. That brings me to the present moment, which is I'm in the conversation with some people here in Colorado who are developing a research platform for psilocybin research, for mass research. Now, I'm not talking about clinical trials right now, although they are offering their platform and they're working with the current research at Johns Hopkins, which is one of the major centers in the world for studying psilocybin now. And they're offering their platform to the people at Johns Hopkins, in addition to other methodologies that are being used at Johns Hopkins. And my idea is to use the values assessment as a pre-post measure in a clinical trial or in a broad social experiment. So people could download an app, they could get a profile of their values, or at least a portion of it, because the methodology is extremely sophisticated and rich and doesn't lend itself to self-analysis or self-help, in the way a therapist or a guide would provide that. But it can be used at an initial level in a simple way to give people a sense of what their top values are. And I thought it would be interesting to see if we could introduce that and offer that to people as an app who are experimenting with psilocybin and other psychedelics to do a measure of their values, and then to do after the experience, to do a post measure on their own and see what shifts, if any, have occurred in their values and worldviews. I thought that might be an interesting experiment. So I'm coming full circle now, actually integrating the old days with the new days, so to speak. My background and expertise in being a guide and a facilitator and a so-called expert in psychedelics, with my many years' work in human values, and seeing if there's a way that I can bring these two streams together in a way that's synergistic. I believe it's highly synergistic. And we'll have to see if we can find the funding for that. So I'm going to be approaching some of the current people who are bankrolling some of the current research in the medicalization area, because I think what's needed here is some other assessments that can get at other dimensions of consciousness than simply looking at scales that have to do with PTSD scales, which are important. I don't mean to underestimate the importance of that. They're very important. You want to see a shift in the classical measures of post-trauma, indicators, but going to the level of values to see what shifts in lifestyle and in human perspectives may arise to provide. And we all know it happens, right? Millions of pages have been written on anecdotal experiences, but to have a measure of values I think that would be used in that context might be interesting.
I might know some people you could talk to. We're actually involved in a company in Canada right now doing some research and development, and we'll definitely talk after the show.
Great.
And that leads me to my next question, which I hear a lot of people wondering about. And you first had experience with pure psilocybin from Sandoz, and I'm just curious what your experiences were from pure psilocybin, the molecule which they're using at Johns Hopkins and a lot of research because it's more controlled, versus the full mushroom, whether it's psilocybin cubensis or another form, and also LSD. And have you found the differences between those and the future of this research and pushing these fungal-based entheogens into the world? What form have you found to be the most powerful and the most effective to push this research?
Let me say this. I think speaking only from my own experience, I don't find a lot of difference, if my memory serves me correctly, between the synthetic and the natural with respect to psilocybin. Now, LSD by definition is synthetic. Okay? I find, again, the same primary dimension of a deeply transformational aesthetic. So set and setting, again, are, to me, more critical variables than whether it's a natural or a synthetic. Now, having said that, I also recognize, given my background, that there are multiple naturally occurring alkaloids and other substances in natural products that are not present in synthetics. And those may well have important influence also. But again, I think that is trumped, if you excuse the expression, by the set and setting. And if you're looking for a developing, as pharmaceutical agents have to do, standards of purity and reliability and coefficients that relate to that, I think you have to move to a synthetic platform. Also, but having said that, also, I would hope that the medical establishment and pharmaceutical establishment would not go to war with people who want to continue to avail themselves of using the natural substances. Mm-hmm. And again, I've been, experimenting with psilocybin in natural form, but I don't know where to get, and I wouldn't even bother reaching out to synthetics right now. Okay. So I don't know if I'm answering your question or not. I'm trying to, but I'm giving you a balanced view from my perspective. Now, let me come back for a moment to the point you were saying earlier, because one of the things, for example, that pharmaceutical companies will want to do, and I've already heard discussions about this, for example, is they want to remove the psychedelic effects. They consider those to be side effects. They want to they want to play with the chemistry or the biochemistry of these drugs to cure depression, assuming that the drug itself will do that, because they're ignoring set and setting in that process. So what they want to do is rule out chemically or biochemically to remove the whatever they need to remove to eliminate the psychedelic effect, which they consider, from that perspective, that worldview, a side effect, undesirable side effect. Now, from my perspective, and most people who have an experience with this stuff, the psychedelic aspect, the psychospiritual aspects are the critical aspects to healing. That is what actually does the work.
I know. I'll follow that up. I have two stories. I'll make them quick. The first one was my first experience with ayahuasca, and I was in Iquitos, Peru at this point. I don't know how many years ago, and it was my first time ever drinking, and I didn't know what to expect. And I was expecting, this grandiose event to happen, and nothing happened. And I was waiting, and I ended up falling asleep because the Icaros were really peaceful and really nice, and I fell asleep. And my intention, at that point, I had pretty bad social anxiety. And so that was my intention for the night, was to help with that. And I remember the next morning, people were like, "Oh, I was seeing snakes through the walls, and all, I was meeting my past life and all these crazy experiences." And I was like, I fell asleep, and I didn't notice anything. And I was talking to everyone, and I talked with one of the guides after, and she said, "How was your experience?" And I said, "Well, it was kind of anticlimactic. I fell asleep and nothing happened." And she goes, "What was your intention?" I said, "To help with social anxiety." And she said, "Well, I just saw you speak to every single person in the group and had a very animate conversation." And I said, "Oh, I guess it did work." And the other experience was through, tapping into the more, to the spirits of these plants and fungi. I, learned this, had this routine of tapping into the spirit of whatever entheogen that I was working with. And so made a list of my intentions for the journey, and was having a conversation with the spirit of mushrooms before my journey, before ingesting. And we're like going through the list, and I was getting this feedback from the spirit of the mushrooms, and it's like, "Okay, do this in your life, do that, this is what you need to work on, look at this, XYZ. And I was like, okay, ready for the journey. And so, ate them, and the rest of the night was silent. Didn't feel a thing, so to speak. And I tuned back in. I was like, hey, let's get to work, and the spirit of the mushrooms was like, we already did it. So, and that really, was like, the journey is way beyond just that, 4-hour experience or whatever it is. And like you noted with the prison experiments, it's like some of the most valuable experiences are actually afterwards, the integration, or pre, the set coming into the space.
Yes.
So the journey is way beyond, ingestion.
Absolutely. It's a complex gestalt, if you will. And even the experience itself of going into stillness, into, absolute stillness and emptiness, to use the phrase of a Buddhist or Advaita spiritual path. Moving into emptiness and stillness is a very deep, profound experience. It's deeply transformational. It can be, as opposed to all the fireworks, right?
Right.
But we're conditioned through the popular media and through word of mouth and all kinds of stuff, and to want and need the fireworks. Otherwise, we feel we're missing something. It's
right.
actually reality. The truth is very simple, and opening a window into, I'm using these phrases that come from the tradition of, the spiritual traditions, of moving into stillness, into emptiness, into nothingness, okay? Which is one of the experiences that one can have, for example, with DMT, that particular trip or substance relating to ayahuasca, okay? I've not taken ayahuasca, but I've taken DMT a number of times in my life. And that is, again, off the charts in terms of the dissolving of any fabric of reality, of moving into total emptiness, into the void, if you will, which is described a lot in traditional literature, spiritual and mystical literature. So you don't have to have the fireworks.
Right.
And it sounds to me, those two experiences you described were exactly what your body, mind, soul needed at the time.
Exactly. Yeah. And, maybe for people, they don't need, quote unquote, the fireworks or the side effects. And for other people, that is the main medicine for them. And you need that ego dissolution, or seeing your lens and seeing reality. But for some people, it's just, for some people, they're so entrapped with their trauma that any form of the quote unquote side effects would be, wig them out too far. And it may be exactly what they need. And for some people, they might need a very soft beginning and tiptoe in. And then maybe a little bit further in, they might want more of a profound experience with that those consciousness altering effects. And
yes, that's very much a function of what the guide can offer and what a trained, sensitive guide can do. Just to share with you an anecdote in that regard, for example, after many, many years, I'm talking my last historical psychedelic experience was something in like 64, 65, something like that. Okay. Fast forward to, 2018, 2019, when I started to experiment again a little bit with psilocybin using the natural form. I discovered, for example, as I was sitting there waiting for it to come on, all these visual effects started to happen again. And I was intrigued, but there was a part of me that was witnessing all of this saying, been there, done that, Gunther. What else? What else have you got to show me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so I intentionally took a detour. I shifted consciousness. I shifted my attention away from the psychedelic kaleidoscope.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And because I was working on actually I was revisiting some of the trauma I talked about at the very beginning of our talk today. At this stage of my life, still unraveling some of that early 2-year-old, 1-year-old in utero trauma, believe it or not. And I find that the visual effects were actually a distraction from what my intention was.
I take a very Terence McKenna approach to my journeys. I solo, complete darkness, blindfold.
Yeah.
Sometimes I like to start in nature, but I'm not there for the fireworks, like you were saying. I'm there to work. I'm there to do some work, and
Absolutely.
I want to roll up my sleeves and let's get into it. And I tend to do it alone in complete darkness and like let's shoot right for it. Let's not take detours, the scenic route.
Right.
I'm here to get my hands dirty. So let's go.
Yeah. So, the same for me. I mean, I sit in this chair for 6-7 hours with a blindfold, the same thing you're describing. I mean, nature is wonderful. And I live up on a mountaintop in Colorado, surrounded by hiking trails at our doorstep. But, later on when I have some mobility, yeah, of course. But in the heart of the session, I want to do the inner exploration. So it's basically sensory deprivation, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. And I have a minimal interaction. My wife, again, will come in and, honey, do you need any water? Do you need anything? And I'll say, Ellen, yeah, would you please write down? And I'll give her a couple of things ideas or thoughts that have come up that I want to preserve. She makes a note. Then she leaves and she say, I have a little buzzer if I need her to buzzer, but it's almost all alone for 6-7 hours, basically. That's what it's about. And it's incredible. And I, again, it's not something I'm doing a lot, by no means. I don't, maybe once a year, maybe twice a year. And it's really because I want to work on something very concrete. And right now I'm working on my own death, preparing for my own death. Not that I'm about to die, as far as I know. I'm actually in pretty good health, and it's not about any kind of morbidity or negativity or despair, or nothing like that. I want to die consciously.
Yeah.
I want to die in full awareness. Okay. And so I'm again exploring what the obstacles are in consciousness to experience that kind of death, to the extent that I can even presume to address those outside of the actual experience of dying physically.
A lot of people talk about psychedelics as death practice or death rehearsal.
Yeah.
So even if you're young and you're taking it, there's still these implications that this is essentially what you're doing.
Yes. Of course, there's a lot more to it because, depending on your state of health, the level of pain your body may be experiencing, the level of fear that I think where the psychedelics can really help is with the recognizing of the role of thought and belief and the mind stuff that arises. But when one is in severe physical pain, you gotta have the option of recognizing that may trump everything. I don't know. None of us knows until we actually do it.
Right.
Having said that, I feel that these are steps in the right direction. And of course, this is all in the context of the spiritual work that I've been doing for many years, which started basically at the time within the first year of my first psychedelic experiences. We all of us at Harvard got interested in various traditions, including Tibetan Buddhism, Hinduism, Vedic studies, Taoism. For me, it was the work of Gurdjieff, whose photograph is here behind me, and that system of inner work, which also led me to a lot of work in Taoism. You mentioned, I've been a teacher and student of Tai Chi and Qigong for many years. A lot of that has helped my vitality and health. So, yeah, what else?
They're all tools, for the same journey.
Yeah. We just had a podcast with Vanya Palmers. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he was involved with Franz Wallenschweider. I might be butchering his last name, but he was one of the first people to help conduct a study where they were measuring the effects of psilocybin with experienced meditators. And a whole bit of that conversation was just how meditation and psychedelics, these are both two sides of the same coin. And
yes,
I brought up the story in the beginning of Be Here Now, where Ram Dass talks about his experience with Maharaji, his guru, and taking the 900 micrograms of LSD and not feeling anything, and then going back, I don't know, maybe a couple of years later, and he took an even bigger amount right in front of him with a clock. And he basically said, yogis have been using entheogens for a while and been using them with fasting, and it's just another tool, and you can, if you're deep in practice, you can take these entheogens and not feel any side effects, so to speak, because you're so deep in the practice and it's all going to the same place. You're all in the same journey towards oneness. And so they're just different tools in your tool belt, which is really cool. And you can use multiple tools together, and it might help the journey even more. And it even amplifies that set and setting and that integration of, I'm sure Qigong and other practices help with integration, and to have a yoga asana or other yoga practices or other fields of philosophy, thought, religion, to kind of cradle the experience and help the understanding of that.
Yes, I would agree. I would completely agree with that. And again, speaking only for myself, the psychedelics were the portal that allowed me to begin to explore, and now for many, many years, to continue to explore and develop my spiritual muscles, so to speak. But that requires a form of weightlifting or running or spiritual isometrics or whatever metaphor you want to use. You got to do the work. If you use psychedelics just to get you high or to get you away from pain or away from trauma or if you're using it as an escape, it will have a very deleterious effect. It actually turns on itself. It's like the genie in the bottle. That's the perfect metaphor for it. If you're using it that way to replicate the experience of oneness and emptiness repeatedly, it will not do the work. It's a blind alley at that point. But to use it as a way of opening up the possibility for transformation, absolutely. And then periodically, if you want to explore some particular issues, and they might be creative, they might be scientific. There are a lot of interesting stories about Nobel Prize winners, like, Crick discovering, DNA, right, through psychedelics. Wow. Or Steve Jobs, being influenced around his vision of kind of the Japanese Zen minimalism design, right? And the idea of a computer being able to transform society, not just a business tool, but actually being utilized for deeper transformation. His own psychedelic experiences, I'm certain, were part of that.
Yeah, that's such a compelling conversation. And way of using psychedelics is just to enhance your own creativity and creation, and weaving it into something like engineering a tin can.
Mhm.
These are all like such profound impacts that this can have on us as a society and improve in every possible way you could imagine.
Yes.
And there's something I'm curious about, and I kind of want to rewind. Did anyone in your circle ever isolate another compound within a psychedelic mushroom and test that in bigger doses? So we were talking about the other alkaloids that, of course, are doing something to our neurochemistry, but we're not sure. It doesn't seem like that's the active component because the psilocybin synthetic and the mushroom are comparable. But what if you were to take a large dose of like norbaeocystin or baeocystin or another compound that's within that? Did anyone ever do this?
In our group, with the exception of Ralph Metzner, who took some advanced courses in pharmacology, none of us were chemists or biochemists. So, and we had a lot of connections into those worlds. And I'm pretty confident that Tim experimented with some other things that were provided by people, by the underground chemists, so to speak, who, including Oswald and others who were relatively well known at that time or later. But speaking for myself, I've only experienced psilocybin, LSD, and DMT and MDMA. If you want to classify MDMA as psychedelic, which I think you can. I've actually never taken ayahuasca in that setting. But again, my experience goes back to the 60s, and a lot of the things you're describing, and there's constant stuff being developed. You move a molecule or a couple of molecules, and you have another product, if you will. So and I'm sure there's a lot of that going on right now. It has been for a while.
You talked about weaving together the value system with the psilocybin renaissance, and I think that unbelievable. What else do you see as the future of fungal-based entheogens?
Well, I don't know. Okay, I mean, what I'm tempted to say here is I find mushroom medicine to be very powerful. Okay, I'm not talking about psychedelic effects. I'm talking about just the straight medical, nutritional support, which I make extensive use of cordyceps and other products in this area. So I think there's a great potential for a deeper understanding and awakening in the population of the importance of these medicines. Now, with respect to the psychedelics, again, I don't know what to say there. I think right now we're on a fast track towards medicalization, commercialization. There are attendant risks and dangers involved in that. They're different than the risks and dangers we encountered back in the 60s, which were political, and social. Now, again, the lust for profits and again, the reliance on medications. I'm concerned that the current risk might co-opt the broader benefits of these sacred medicines in whatever form, and tie them too closely or subsume them or co-opt them by a commercial motivation and a power motivation. Okay.
And what kind of advice would you give people like us who are just average consumers, and then anyone else who's potentially involved in the entrepreneurship surrounding this shroom boom or mush rush, to not end up there and not go towards a only capitalistic model of only being able to access the psilocybin, and for just taking the therapeuticness out of it and making money the number one driver? Like, what would you say to people, and what advice would you give us with this new renaissance where we're trying again? We have a second chance as a society. How do we do it right?
Know yourself, know your own motivations, know your values, know your worldview. Have that level of insight and honesty that's required. Having that integrity and honesty, and pick your partnerships very carefully. And even that's not a guarantee. But you do the best you can on your terms, on your own terms, to be as clear-headed and as pure in motivation, have as clear integrity and honesty about your own motivation, and pick your partnerships carefully.
You said it twice.
So let's revert the lens in another zeitgeist or worldview. And this is a question that we ask all our guests on our show. And the question is, if mushrooms had the microphone and could say one thing to the whole human race, what would they say?
Check me out.
I love that. We're going to compile all of these answers from all the different guests that we've had and maybe make a little zine to go with it. Some secondhand advice straight from the mushrooms.
I love it. That's great. Wonderful. Yeah.
We want to thank you so much for coming on. Where can listeners follow your work and maybe get in touch with you, check out your history, maybe if they want to check out your value mentorship?
Sure. Well, I'm on Facebook under my name. I have a LinkedIn account, and I have a website, which is www.valuementors.com. Valuementors, plural.com.
Awesome. And I'll have all of that in the show notes for anybody listening and curious.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation today. And as I say, I love your products. I've really been enjoying, particularly the cordyceps, which is a staple for me, and I really like it very much. It's very pure, and it works very rapidly for restoring energy.
Oh, we got more where that came from. Don't you worry. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in, shrooming in, listening for an hour and a half for our conversations and tuning in to another episode of Mushroom Revival Podcast. If this is your first episode, please check out more. You can check out our website, www.mushroomrevival.com, where we have all the podcasts. We have the cordyceps that Gunther was talking about and a whole line of functional mushroom extracts. We plant a tree for every product that we sell, so making the world a better place inside and out. And please reach out to us if you have any future topics that you want us to talk about, or guests that you want us to bring on our show. We'd love to explore and meet new people and dive down the rabbit hole with as many people as possible. So thank you. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please hit that subscribe button, or YouTube right now, hit that subscribe button, share with your friends, leave a review, whatever's honest and integral, whether it's 1 star, 5 star, bad, good, whatever you feel is true. And as always, much love, and may the spores be with you.